For years, royal watchers waited for another carefully worded statement, another soft clarification, another line that left room for interpretation. That's why this moment landed like a shockwave. One announcement. No walk back, no clarification window, no sources say. Just a sentence so final that even seasoned palace insiders paused before reacting. This wasn't a leak floated to test public reaction. It wasn't a rumor whispered through tabloids. It wasn't anonymous language buried behind palace protocol. Prince William put his own name on it. Direct, deliberate, unmistakable. And once that happened, everything changed. Because when a future king abandons ambiguity, it's never accidental. This decision doesn't just affect Meghan Markle or her standing. It redraws the boundaries of the monarchy itself. It signals how power will be exercised going forward, what will be tolerated, and what will never be allowed again. William has built his entire public life on restraint, on silence, on endurance. He absorbed criticism. He allowed speculation to swirl. He waited while others spoke. That patience became his signature, which is exactly why this moment matters so much. So, why now? Why choose finality over flexibility? Why close a door that had been left slightly open for years? Because silence stopped protecting anyone. For most of his adult life, William has been defined by what he didn't say. While scandals flared and headlines spiraled, he chose restraint. While others corrected narratives or pushed back publicly, he stayed silent. Discipline wasn't just a personal trait, it was the job. He understood the unwritten rule of heirs: you absorb criticism, so the institution doesn't have to. That restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Silence allowed storms to pass without lending them oxygen. Speculation came and went. Rumors peaked and faded. Through it all, William maintained the posture expected of a future king: steady, unreactive, and patient. If there was confusion, it wasn't clarified. If there was provocation, it wasn't acknowledged. The crown endured by refusing to engage. For years, that approach worked. The monarchy survived because its heir refused to personalize attacks or legitimize noise. Every time he didn't respond, he reinforced stability. Every time he waited, he preserved distance. That patience became his public identity. Calm, calculated, impossibly controlled, which is why this moment feels so jarring. This wasn't a minor shift in tone. It wasn't a gradual evolution. It was a complete break from pattern. When someone who has mastered silence suddenly chooses clarity, it signals that the old rules stopped functioning, that whatever was being managed quietly could no longer be contained that way. William didn't abandon restraint lightly. He didn't wake up impulsive. This move only makes sense if patience itself became a liability. If silence stopped protecting the institution, it was meant to shield. And that raises the question no one inside royal circles could ignore anymore. So what finally pushed him to speak? For generations, royal ambiguity served a purpose. Vague language wasn't weakness, it was diplomacy. Carefully chosen words allowed tensions to cool, relationships to heal, and situations to evolve without forcing anyone into a corner. Maybe meant flexibility. Silence meant patience. The door was never slammed because leaving it ajar preserved options. But over time, that system changed. What once protected the crown slowly became a tool that could be used against it. Soft phrasing stopped calming situations and started feeding them. Every non-answer created a new headline. Every carefully balanced statement invited interpretation. Ambiguity wasn't diffusing conflict anymore, it was sustaining it. Titles in particular shifted meaning. They stopped functioning purely as tradition and began operating as currency. Leverage, a way to signal relevance, authority, and proximity to power, even after stepping away from duty. As long as nothing was stated definitively, the implication remained. Connections were intact, access was possible, influence still existed. That illusion mattered. Each time the palace avoided final language, it left room for narratives to be stretched, reframed, and reused. Public messaging became elastic. Boundaries blurred. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to separate reality from suggestion. At some point, Prince William recognized a hard truth. The open door he believed symbolized dignity, and restraint was being treated as permission. What was meant to protect the monarchy was now exposing it. Diplomacy had turned into vulnerability. And once that realization set in, ambiguity was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. because the next phase wasn't about titles or wording anymore. And then the focus shifted to someone William would never ignore. At first glance, the coverage looked familiar. Background noise, the kind of media turbulence senior royals learned to live with. But this wasn't random criticism, and it wasn't loud chaos. It was timing, and timing changes everything. Each time Catherine, Princess of Wales, launched a major initiative, early childhood development, long-term mental health work, policy-focused outreach, something followed. Within hours, sometimes a day, negative stories surfaced, not crude attacks, subtle ones, carefully phrased, vague sourcing, the kind that plants doubt without leaving fingerprints. Once or twice could be dismissed. Patterns couldn't. What made this different was Catherine's response, or rather, her lack of one. She didn't complain. She didn't lash out. She didn't ask for statements or corrections. Instead, she did what few expected. She kept records, dates, headlines, language similarities, timelines. Quietly, methodically, she documented how often positive work was immediately overshadowed by targeted narratives. When those records were finally presented, the shift was instant. This was no longer about bruised feelings or sibling tension. It wasn't tabloid drama spiraling out of control. It was coordination, interference, a strategic effort that undermined credibility at precise moments. And that reframed everything. For William, this was the line. Catherine isn't just his wife. She represents the future stability of the monarchy. Attacks against her weren't personal annoyances, they were institutional threats. Subtle, calculated, and designed to erode trust over time. That realization changed the stakes entirely, because once the future queen became the target, indifference was no longer an option. That's when concern turned into urgency. What had once looked like isolated criticism began revealing a different shape online. It wasn't loud outrage or viral backlash. It was repetition, waves of posts arriving together, identical phrasing, familiar talking points resurfacing across platforms within the same narrow windows of time. This wasn't organic disagreement. It was amplification. The narratives didn't wander. They aimed. Same targets, same framing, same insinuations recycled and reinforced until they felt unavoidable. And at the center of it all was Catherine, Princess of Wales. Not because she was controversial, but because she was visible, respected, and increasingly influential. That made her vulnerable. Royal security teams and digital analysts began flagging the activity. Patterns emerged that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or coincidence-driven outrage. Accounts moved together. Messaging escalated in sync. Moments meant to highlight Catherine's work were drowned out by manufactured doubt. What looked like public sentiment was being shaped, nudged, and pushed. This was the moment everything changed. Because once coordinated digital pressure enters the picture, the issue stops being emotional and starts being structural. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family disputes spilling into the press. It was about perception management at scale, about destabilizing trust, about eroding confidence in the people meant to carry the monarchy forward. For Prince William, that realization was sobering. The crown isn't just tradition, it's continuity. And continuity depends on public confidence. When messaging becomes engineered rather than earned, the risk isn't reputational, it's institutional. What felt personal suddenly became strategic. What seemed manageable became dangerous, and ignoring it was no longer an option. But William wasn't the only one struggling with what to do next. For King Charles III, the situation cut deeper than politics or optics. This was his son, and for as long as possible, Charles held on to the belief that time could heal what confrontation might only harden. He hoped distance would cool tempers, that patience would eventually lead to reconciliation, that if the crown stayed quiet long enough, something could still be salvaged. But the delays didn't bring peace, they brought chaos. Every unanswered question sparked another media cycle. Every pause created space for speculation to grow. Palace teams found themselves trapped in reactive mode, constantly managing fallout instead of advancing policy diplomacy or long-term planning. Staff were exhausted. Communications were stretched thin. Energy that should have been spent on governance was diverted to damage control. And all of this unfolded as Charles faced pressures few monarchs experienced simultaneously. Health concerns, a new reign still finding its footing, global scrutiny, the weight of history pressing in from all sides. The emotional toll wasn't abstract, it was visible. Hope had slowly turned into paralysis. William watched this closely. He saw the cost of indecision. He saw how sentiment, however understandable, was being exploited. What Charles viewed as compassion, William began to see as vulnerability. The longer boundaries remained unclear, the more power shifted away from the institution and into the hands of those willing to manipulate ambiguity. This wasn't a judgment of his father. It was a realization. William understood something Charles wasn't ready to accept, yet the monarchy couldn't survive on hope alone. Love could not substitute for limits. And waiting wasn't neutral anymore. It was harmful. The moment demanded clarity, not comfort. Then came the voice that ended the debate. When Princess Anne spoke, there was no drama in her tone, no emotion to soften the message, no attempt to balance feelings. Anne has spent her entire life inside the machinery of the monarchy, and she understands something others struggle to accept. Institutions don't survive on empathy alone. They survive on boundaries. Her words were blunt. You can't protect everyone. And the meaning behind them was unmistakable. Every system has a breaking point. When instability is allowed to persist in the name of compassion, the damage spreads. Choosing not to choose is still a decision, and often the most dangerous one. Anne framed the situation exactly as it was. This wasn't about personalities or past grievances. It wasn't about who felt wronged or who deserved understanding. It was about structure, about whether the monarchy would continue to function with clarity or drift into permanent uncertainty. In moments like this, there is no middle ground. You protect the institution, or you allow it to be undermined by individuals who no longer operate within its rules. That clarity hit William hard. He had been searching for a way to shield everyone, to preserve family ties while maintaining institutional integrity. Anne dismantled that illusion completely. You don't get both. Not when the stakes are this high. Indecision wasn't neutral. It was costing the crown credibility, stability, and control. And suddenly, the choice wasn't cruel. It was necessary. This wasn't about punishment or retaliation. It was about enforcing limits so the system could function. Anne didn't offer comfort. She offered truth. And once William accepted it, the path forward narrowed quickly. Because once you acknowledge there is no middle ground, delay becomes impossible. Once that clicked, the ending became inevitable. The announcement didn't arrive wrapped in soft language or filtered through intermediaries. There were no unnamed advisors, no palace sources, no strategic ambiguity left to decode. Prince William attached his own name directly, and that detail mattered more than any single sentence inside it. In royal terms, this was extraordinary. By putting his name on the statement, William stripped away every familiar escape hatch. There would be no reinterpretation later. No, what was meant was clarification. No quiet reframing once public reaction settled. The language was deliberate, tight, and final. It didn't hint, it didn't threaten, it didn't test the waters. It closed them. Insiders understood immediately what the public would take longer to process. This wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't leverage. It wasn't an opening move in a negotiation. It was the end of the conversation. When William speaks, this directly debate is over. That's the signal. Every word was engineered to remove flexibility. No conditional phrasing, no future-facing optimism, no suggestion that time or behavior could change the outcome. This wasn't about emotion or frustration. It was procedural, structural. A line drawn so clearly it couldn't be stepped around. That's why the reaction inside royal circles was so muted and so serious. There was nothing to spin, nothing to soften, nothing to delay. The decision had already been executed the moment it was spoken. This wasn't symbolic. It was operational. A permanent boundary, not a tactic. A conclusion, not an opening. And once that boundary existed publicly, the consequences were unavoidable, and the impact landed very differently on each side. The moment didn't unfold in public. There was no spectacle, no cameras, just a private realization settling in quietly. Prince Harry received the news away from palace walls, stripped of the familiar buffers that once softened every blow. This wasn't filtered through aides or framed as temporary. It was direct, final, and unmistakable. For Meghan Markle, the shift was even more profound. For years, ambiguity had been an asset. It allowed narratives to bend, timelines to blur, possibilities to remain open-ended. As long as nothing was stated definitively, flexibility existed. That flexibility was power, and now it was gone. What replaced it wasn't punishment, it was clarity. Independence, yes, but independence without institutional backing. No coordination with royal schedules, no alignment with palace messaging, no behind-the-scenes support, no security structure tied to the crown, no future inclusion framed as someday or under the right circumstances. The door didn't just close, it was removed. This wasn't exile, it was separation. Meghan's future would now be shaped entirely by her own decisions, her own network, her own strategy. The monarchy would no longer absorb fallout, correct misunderstandings, or provide silent reinforcement. Every action would stand alone. Every outcome would be owned fully. Freedom often sounds empowering, but freedom without a safety net carries weight. Responsibility becomes absolute. There's no institution left to lean on, no ambiguity to hide behind, no shared burden. For the monarchy, this meant control was restored, boundaries clarified, risk contained. And for Harry and Meghan, it marked the end of a long, uncertain middle ground, which leaves one uncomfortable truth. This moment was never about revenge. It wasn't fueled by anger, spite, or a desire to embarrass anyone. What made it so jarring is the opposite. It was calm, measured, final, resolution, not retaliation. Prince William didn't act because he was provoked. He acted because waiting stopped working. Hope had become a liability. Ambiguity had turned into exposure, and sentiment, however human, was no longer compatible with protecting the institution he is destined to lead. In choosing certainty over hope, William revealed something essential about the kind of monarch he intends to be. One who understands that clarity stabilizes systems, that boundaries prevent chaos, that leadership sometimes requires closing doors rather than leaving them half open in the name of goodwill. This decision wasn't about punishing the past. It was about safeguarding the future. The monarchy cannot function on illusion suggestion or endless reinterpretation. It survives on structure, on limits, on knowing where lines are drawn and refusing to blur them when pressure mounts. History will debate the personal cost. It will dissect the timing. It will argue whether reconciliation was still possible. But one truth is already clear. William chose the institution over uncertainty, control over confusion, responsibility over comfort. And that choice will define his reign far more than any speech or ceremony ever could. So here's the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. If ambiguity was the real source of power, who lost the most when it disappeared?